When my mom got married, I kept the $50 million my late grandmother left me a secret. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made. Just days later, my mom's new husband showed up at my door uninvited, lawyer at his side. The knock came at 7 in the morning, 6 days after the wedding. There's a particular quality to a knock that isn't a delivery and isn't a neighbor. It has weight to it. I looked through the peephole, and there was my mother's new husband, 6 days married, standing on my porch in a suit he does not wear to make coffee, and beside him, a man holding a leather briefcase. Neither of them was smiling, which was the detail that told me the most. He looked like a man rehearsing a difficult conversation in his head, and the man next to him just looked like a lawyer being paid to be there and nothing more. I almost didn't answer. Not answering felt like its own kind of confession, though, like admitting there was something to hide from. So I opened the door about halfway, enough to see them clearly. "Can I help you?" I said. "We just want to talk something through," he said, in that careful, rehearsed evenness people use when they practiced a conversation in the car. The lawyer said nothing at all, which unsettled me more. Lawyers who are there to help usually introduce themselves. None of this makes sense, though, without understanding what happened 2 years earlier in my grandmother's kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday that I didn't know at the time was going to be one of the most important days of my life. I'm 31. I live alone in a converted carriage house about 20 minutes outside the city, and up until that Tuesday, I would have told you my grandmother was simply a wealthy older woman who liked her privacy, her garden, and her crossword. Everyone in the family knew there was money. What nobody knew, including me, was how much, where it actually was, or what she intended to do with it. My grandmother had built a small fortune over 5 decades, starting from essentially nothing, and she had exactly one rule about discussing any of it. She didn't. Not with my mother, not with my uncle, not with any of the cousins who circled around her at holidays with the particular attentiveness of people angling for something. She was polite to everyone and specific with no one. That Tuesday, she called me over for what she said was lunch, and mostly we talked about her tomato plants. She had strong opinions about tomato plants, a whole philosophy about overwatering delivered with the seriousness other people reserve for actual philosophy. It was one of the few relationships in my life that had never required anything of me except showing up. As I was leaving, though, she handed me a plain envelope. No markings on it, nothing written on the outside, just a sealed envelope she pulled out of a kitchen drawer like it had been waiting there for exactly this moment. "Don't open this until after I'm gone," she said. I laughed a little, the way you do when someone says something morbid in a casual tone, and told her not to talk that way. She didn't laugh back. She just looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before and said, "Promise me." So I promised, took the envelope home, and put it in my nightstand drawer, where it stayed for months, because that's what you do with an envelope like that. You don't sit around anticipating the death of someone you love. You let yourself believe there's more time than there is. There wasn't much more time, as it turned out. My grandmother passed away 8 months later, quietly, in her sleep, in the house she'd lived in for 40 years, and the days after that are mostly a blur to me now. A blur of phone calls and funeral arrangements and my mother crying in a way I'd never seen before. Because whatever else was true about my grandmother's relationship with the rest of the family, she was still my mother's mother, and grief doesn't care about the complicated parts. I didn't open the envelope until after the funeral, after the will had been read in a lawyer's office that smelled like old paper and coffee, after everyone had heard the number that was supposedly the whole of my grandmother's estate. It wasn't small. It was enough to make my uncle's jaw visibly tighten, and enough to make a couple of the cousins go quiet in that particular way people go quiet when they're doing math in their heads. But it also wasn't the number I would later learn was the real one, and I didn't know that yet, sitting in my car in the parking lot outside that office, finally opening the envelope my grandmother had given me all those months before. Inside was a single handwritten note, folded twice. It didn't mention money, property, or investments at all. It said, in her small, precise handwriting, that if anyone outside her attorney ever asked me about her assets, I was to answer as little as possible, and that before I signed or agreed to anything regarding her estate, I was to make one phone call. There was a number written below that, and nothing else. No explanation. Just an instruction, delivered with the same quiet certainty she'd used to tell me not to overwater tomatoes. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, not understanding what I was looking at. I assumed it was some kind of formality, maybe something related to probate she wanted handled a particular way. I put the note in my wallet, where it stayed for the better part of 2 years, occasionally rediscovered, always making me think of her for a second. I want to say I thought about that note constantly, that I carried some sense of foreboding around with me the whole time, but that wouldn't be true. Life continued. I went to work. I dated a little, unsuccessfully. My mother, about a year after the funeral, started seeing someone, and I was, if anything, glad for her. She'd been alone since my father passed when I was in high school, and watching her rebuild some kind of romantic life in her 50s felt like a good thing, a hopeful thing, the kind of development you're supposed to root for. Her new husband seemed fine at first, more than fine, actually. He was the kind of person who remembered small details about you and brought them up later, who showed up on time and sometimes early, who asked good questions at dinner and actually listened to the answers. My mother lit up around him in a way I hadn't seen in years. If you had told me in those early months that I would eventually be standing at my own front door looking at this man through a peephole with a rising sense of dread, I would have told you that you had the wrong wrong family entirely. Conversations have a way of drifting, though, if you pay attention to them over enough time, and looking back, I can trace exactly when his started drifting toward my grandmother's money. The first comment came about 4 months into their relationship, over dinner at my mother's house. Her boyfriend at the time had made a roast, genuinely good, and I remember thinking that a man who could cook like that, and also remembered to ask about my job, was, on paper, exactly what my mother deserved after everything. Partway through the meal, he asked, in a tone so casual it barely registered, whether my grandmother had ever mentioned the lake cabin. I didn't even know there was a lake cabin. He laughed it off, said he must have misheard about a family property upstate, and the conversation moved on. The second comment was smaller, at a barbecue, when he mentioned it must have been a lot of paperwork to sort through after my grandmother passed. I said it wasn't too bad since the actual paperwork had gone through her lawyer's office. He nodded and the conversation moved on. Individually, none of these comments were strange. People ask about money. People are curious about lake cabins and paperwork and estates, especially when they're getting closer to a family that clearly has some. If he had asked me these questions once each, spread across a year, I probably never would have noticed a pattern at all, but they kept coming, small and spaced out and always phrased in a way that made them easy to answer without really answering. And somewhere around the 6th or 7th variation of the same underlying question, I started keeping track, not consciously at first, just a low background awareness that every conversation with this man eventually found its way back to my grandmother's estate, the way a compass needle always finds north, regardless of which direction you start turning it. I gave him short, harmless answers every time. I told myself it was curiosity, the ordinary kind people have about money that isn't theirs, the kind that shows up at weddings and funerals and family gatherings whenever there's an inheritance in the room. I told myself he was just making conversation, filling silences, trying to connect with a family that wasn't naturally his yet. It was not curiosity. My mother started calling more too, around the same time, which in retrospect I should have paid closer attention to, because my mother and I have never been the kind of family that talks on the phone just to talk. We love each other. We're just not chatty. A call from my mother historically meant she needed something specific, a ride somewhere, help moving furniture, advice about a form she didn't understand. So when she started calling just to ask how work was going, whether I was seeing anyone, whether I'd thought about moving somewhere closer to her, I noticed the shift even though I didn't understand it yet. One evening, on one of these calls, she asked, almost too casually, whether my grandmother had ever mentioned setting up some kind of trust. I laughed it off at the time, told her I had no idea, and she said, "Oh, it's nothing. I was just curious." And we moved on to talking about something else. But that question sat with me afterward, in a way the others hadn't. It was too specific. Lake cabins and paperwork are the kinds of things you ask about idly. A trust is the kind of thing you ask about when you already suspect one exists and you're trying to find out how much of one. Looking back now, I think that question had been sitting in a drawer somewhere in my mother's mind for months, maybe longer, waiting for the right moment to come out, the same way my grandmother's envelope had sat in my nightstand waiting for its moment. I don't think my mother was being malicious when she asked it. I think, honestly, that she was being managed, gently and patiently, by someone who understood exactly which questions to plant and how long to let them grow before harvesting the answer. I didn't say any of this to my mother, of course. What was I supposed to say? Something feels off about the man you're dating, based on a pattern of dinner table small talk I've been quietly cataloging for months. It would have sounded paranoid. It would have sounded like jealousy or overprotectiveness or whatever unflattering label people reach for when a son doesn't immediately embrace his mother's new partner. So I said nothing, and the relationship continued. And about 8 months after they'd started dating, he proposed. The wedding was small. It was held at a restored barn about an hour outside the city, the kind of venue that photographs beautifully and costs exactly what you'd expect. And I remember standing near the back thinking my mother looked genuinely happy, happier than I'd seen her in years, and reminding myself none of my quiet suspicions were worth ruining this for her. My uncle came, along with a handful of cousins. I noticed how many of them made a point of finding the groom during the reception, shaking his hand a little longer than necessary, establishing some kind of connection with the man now officially part of the family that had once had my grandmother in it. He handled all of it well, warm without being obsequious, funny without trying too hard. Watching him work the room, I found myself wondering if I'd built an entire narrative out of nothing. Maybe the lake cabin and the paperwork and the trust question were nothing more than what they appeared to be. I wanted to believe that, right up until the reception was winding down and I had a conversation with my uncle that I still think about. We were near the bar, both of us a couple of drinks in, and my uncle, who had never been particularly subtle about anything, leaned in and said, low enough that no one else could hear, "You know, he asked me about the estate at Christmas." I asked what he meant. "2 Christmases ago," my uncle said, "before he and your mother were even serious, asked me straight out what your grandmother was worth. I told him it wasn't any of his business, and he laughed it off, said he was just making conversation." My uncle shrugged, the particular shrug of a man who has decided a thing isn't worth fighting about, but wants you to know he noticed it anyway. Probably nothing. People are curious about money. But I always thought it was a strange thing to ask a stranger at a Christmas party. I didn't say anything to that beyond some non-committal agreement, but the conversation lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind and stayed there for the rest of the night, humming quietly underneath everything else. The toasts and the dancing and my mother's face when her new husband dipped her at the end of their first dance in a move that got the whole room cheering. 2 Christmases ago would have put that conversation before he and my mother were even officially together, before the dinner table questions about lake cabins, before any of it, which meant the curiosity about my grandmother's estate hadn't started after he met the family. It had started before. Whatever this was, whatever pattern I'd been quietly tracking for months, it went back further than I'd realized, and it hadn't started with my mother at all. It had started with the money, and my mother had simply been the path that led to it. I told myself, driving home that night, that I was reading too much into a secondhand story from an uncle who'd had a few drinks and never particularly liked anyone his sister dated. I told myself that even if he had asked a nosy question at a Christmas party 2 years ago, that didn't prove anything about his intentions now, married and settled and presumably committed to my mother for reasons that had nothing to do with inheritance. I told myself a lot of things that night, and I believed almost none of them. Not really. Not in the part of my brain that had been quietly cataloging small comments for the better part of a year and had just been handed one more data point that didn't fit the innocent explanation no matter how hard I tried to make it fit. 6 days later, there was a knock on my door at 7 in the morning. "We just want to talk something through," he said, and I let them in. I want to be honest about why I let them in. It wasn't hospitality, and it wasn't naivety. Saying no felt like it would confirm something, an admission that I had something to protect and knew it. So I opened the door the rest of the way, and my mother's husband walked in first, the lawyer following a half step behind, the way subordinates follow the person actually in charge of a meeting. He sat down on my couch without being invited to. The lawyer remained standing near the coffee table, his briefcase still closed, resting there like a held breath. I didn't offer coffee, some old habit of hospitality overridden by every instinct telling me this was not a hospitality situation. I noticed his eyes moving around my living room while the silence stretched. They paused on a framed photograph of my grandmother in her garden, then drifted to the small fireproof safe under my desk. He looked away the instant he realized I'd caught him, and something about the speed of that reaction told me more than the look itself had. "I'd like you to read this first," the lawyer said finally, opening the briefcase and sliding a folder across my coffee table. It wasn't a lawsuit. For a few seconds, my mind went to some worst-case legal scenario, and it wasn't that. It was instead a proposed family settlement agreement, several pages long, written in careful, deliberately soft language that makes giving away millions of dollars sound like a thoughtful family gesture rather than what it actually was. A request that I hand a substantial portion of an inheritance to people with no legal claim to it whatsoever. "Your mother doesn't want this to become a legal fight," he said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice pitched somewhere between concern and reason. "There isn't a fight," I said. "There doesn't have to be," he said, "if everyone's reasonable." I kept reading. According to the document, my grandmother had supposedly intended, at some point, for certain family assets to be shared more evenly than the will reflected, and the agreement suggested, in language vague enough to avoid ever quite saying it outright, that I voluntarily transfer a large portion of my inheritance into a newly created family trust, one that my mother and her husband would help oversee going forward. There was no accusation anywhere in the document. There was no threat, just page after page of carefully worded suggestion, dressed up to look like something my grandmother herself might have wanted. I looked up at the lawyer. "Did my grandmother write any of this?" He hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a second, but I caught it, and before he could answer, my mother's husband answered for him. "People talk," he said. That wasn't an answer. That was a way of avoiding one, and I recognized it as such immediately, the same way I'd recognized 6 days earlier at our wedding that a 2-year-old conversation with my uncle meant more than it had first appeared to. I folded the papers and set them back down on the coffee table. "I won't be signing anything today." His expression shifted then, something sliding out from behind the warmth he'd been wearing since he walked in, and for just a moment I saw something else underneath it, something more impatient before he smoothed it back over. "You should probably tell him the real number," he said to the lawyer. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, glancing at him before he spoke, which told me whose meeting this actually was, regardless of whose signature was supposed to be on the settlement. "We understand your grandmother's estate," he said quietly, almost apologetically, "was worth approximately $50 million. They knew the number. That much was clear. What was equally clear, though I couldn't have explained exactly how I knew it, was that they had no real idea where that number actually was, or what form it currently took, or whether the will everyone had heard read out loud in that lawyer's office 2 years ago had ever told the whole story to begin with. "Who told you that?" I asked. "People talk," he said again. The same 2 words, delivered with the same flat finality, as if repetition alone could make an evasion sound like an explanation. I didn't say anything to that. I just looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became a kind of pressure, and then I did something neither of them expected. I picked up my phone and I said, "Give me 1 second," and I walked into my kitchen, out of earshot, and I called someone. Not my grandmother's attorney. Not yet. I called a friend from college who had gone into family law, and who I hadn't spoken to in probably 8 months, and I said, without much preamble, that I needed her to run a name for me, right now, whatever she could find publicly, and I gave her my mother's husband's full legal name and his previous marriage, which my mother had mentioned once in passing, offhandedly, the way you mention an ex you've never met but know exists somewhere in someone's history. My friend called me back 40 minutes later after my mother's husband and the lawyer had left, having gotten nothing from me but a promise to consider the settlement, which I had no intention of considering at all. What she told me changed the entire shape of what I thought was happening. He had been married once before, to a woman I'll call his first wife, for 6 years, and the marriage had ended in a divorce that, according to court filings my friend could access, had involved almost the exact same structure I'd just watched play out in my living room. Her father had died 2 years into the marriage, leaving her a modest but real inheritance, nothing on the scale of my grandmother's estate but not nothing either, and within a year of that death, according to filings from the divorce itself, he had pressured her into moving a significant portion of that inheritance into a joint account, structured almost exactly like the family trust described in the folder currently sitting on my coffee table. The divorce filings alleged that he had drained most of that account within 18 months, through a combination of investments she later described as reckless and expenditures she couldn't account for at all, and that by the time she filed for divorce, most of her father's money was simply gone. I sat at my kitchen table reading through the portions of the filing my friend had forwarded me, and I felt something shift in my understanding of the last several months, something clicking into a different, colder shape. This wasn't a man who had happened to notice over the course of a genuine relationship that his new wife's family had money. This was a pattern. This was something he had done before, with a different woman, a different inheritance, a different lawyer probably saying the exact same careful, soft language things about family and sharing and reasonableness. My mother wasn't the first. My grandmother's $50 million wasn't the first target. It was simply the largest one he had found so far, and the folder on my coffee table wasn't a spontaneous idea born out of 6 days of marriage. It was a script, refined once already on someone else's grief, being run again on mine. I want to be honest about what this discovery did to me, because it wasn't quite what I would have expected. I didn't feel vindicated exactly, even though every instinct I'd been quietly cataloging for the better part of a year had just been confirmed in the starkest possible terms. What I felt mostly was a kind of protective fury on behalf of my mother, who was at that moment at home, presumably still asleep or just waking up, with no idea that the man she'd married 6 days earlier had done this once already, and walked away from the wreckage of it without, as far as I could tell from the filings, any legal consequence at all. His first wife hadn't pursued criminal charges. There wasn't apparently a clean legal mechanism for what he had done, which existed in some gray area between financial mismanagement and outright manipulation that the law doesn't have a tidy name for. I thought about calling my mother right then, waking her up, telling her everything, and some instinct held me back from it. The same instinct, I think, that had kept me from raising any of my suspicions before the wedding. Not because I doubted what I'd learned, but because I understood, sitting there at my kitchen table at 8 in the morning, that if I called my mother now, upset and half-formed, with a story about a college friend and a divorce filing and a pattern I'd only just pieced together, it would sound exactly like what people would assume it was. A son who'd never liked his mother's husband, grasping for ammunition. I needed something more solid than a phone call from an old friend. I needed the kind of proof that couldn't be waved away as jealousy or overprotectiveness. Before I did anything else, though, I wanted him to know that I knew. Not because I expected him to confess to anything over the phone, but because I wanted to watch how he responded to being caught, and because some part of me needed to hear his voice change in real time. I dialed the number and he answered on the second ring, which surprised me, though it shouldn't have. He and the lawyer had left maybe 90 minutes earlier, after I'd told them I needed time to think about the settlement, a lie I'd delivered calmly enough that he had actually looked pleased on his way out the door, like he believed the folder had done its work. "Hey," he said, warm again. The warmth switched back on like a light. "Glad you called. Have you had a chance to look everything over?" I had, obviously, but I wasn't going to tell him what I'd found in the 90 minutes since he'd left. Instead, I asked him a question I already knew the answer to, because I wanted to hear how he'd answer it. I asked whether he'd been married before. There was a pause, brief but real, before he said yes, a long time ago. It hadn't worked out. These things happen. I asked what her name was. Another pause. He told me, and something in his voice had gone careful in a way it hadn't been a moment earlier. "Did she have family money too?" I asked. "I'm not sure what you're getting at." "I think you know exactly what I'm getting at," I said, and I let the silence sit there for a second before I continued. "Her father left her an inheritance. You convinced her to put it into something that looked a lot like the folder currently sitting on my coffee table, and within 18 months, most of it was gone." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call hadn't dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the warmth entirely, replaced by something flatter and more careful, the voice of a man recalculating in real time. "That's not what happened," he said. "She and I had different values about money. It was a difficult marriage. I don't know what you think you found, but you're getting a one-sided version of something you weren't there for." "Maybe," I said, "but I have the divorce filings. I have the account structure. I have the timeline, and I have to tell you, the folder your lawyer put on my table this morning reads almost exactly like the language in those filings, which is either an extraordinary coincidence or it isn't." He didn't have a response to that, not immediately, and in the gap, I found myself thinking about my mother at home, probably still unaware that this conversation was even happening, and I felt something harden in me that hadn't been there an hour hour earlier. Whatever careful, patient approach I might have taken to this if it had simply been a case of a new husband getting overeager about a large inheritance, that approach no longer applied. This wasn't overeagerness. This was a method tested once already on someone else's grief, and my mother had married directly into the second attempt. "I think," he finally said, "that you're making a lot of assumptions based on one side of a very old story, and I think you should be careful about what you say to your mother, given how happy she is right now." I want to be honest that this landed exactly the way he intended it to. It was a threat wearing the clothes of concern, a suggestion that if I disrupted my mother's happiness by telling her what I'd learned, the damage would somehow be mine to own rather than his. For a moment, standing in my kitchen with the framed photo of my grandmother visible through the doorway, I felt the old pull toward silence, the same instinct that had kept me quiet through months of small comments and a Christmas conversation 2 years old and a wedding I'd attended with a knot in my stomach the whole time. But I had promised my grandmother something 2 years earlier in a kitchen very much like the one I was standing in. I had promised to make one phone call before I did anything else, and I hadn't made it yet. Everything up to this point, the college friend, the divorce filings, the confrontation on the phone, all of it had been me working with pieces I'd found on my own. I hadn't yet done the one thing my grandmother had specifically asked of me, and something told me, standing there, that it was time. "I'll be in touch," I told him, and I hung up before he could say anything else. I found the note in my wallet, softened at the creases now from 2 years of being carried around, and I dialed the number written beneath my grandmother's handwriting for the first time since she'd given it to me. A woman answered, professional and unhurried, and when I explained who I was and read her the small amount of context written on the note, she asked me to hold for just a moment. The hold lasted maybe 90 seconds, long enough for me to start second-guessing whether I'd misunderstood the entire instruction, whether this was some outdated number connected to an office that no longer handled my grandmother's affairs at all. Then a man's voice came on the line, calm in a way that suggested he'd been expecting this call for longer than 2 years. "I've been your grandmother's attorney for the last 11 years of her life," he said, "and I've been holding certain instructions in reserve, waiting for exactly this kind of call. I'm glad you finally made it." I asked him what he meant by exactly this kind of call. "Before I answer that," he said, "I need to ask you 3 questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, because your answers determine what I'm authorized to tell you next. Has anyone asked you to sign a document transferring or redistributing any portion of your grandmother's estate?" "Yes," I told him, "this morning." "Has anyone mentioned, in any context, the existence of a trust separate from the will that was read after her passing?" My mother had, months earlier, and her husband had implied something like it more directly today. "Yes," I said. "And has anyone stated or guessed at the actual value of your grandmother's estate, a figure different from the one disclosed in the will?" $50 million, I told him. That's the number the lawyer used this morning. There was a pause on his end, not uncertain the way the earlier pauses on the phone had been, but something more like satisfaction. The pause of a man confirming a hypothesis he'd carried for a long time. "Then I can tell you what your grandmother asked me to tell you. If this exact situation ever arose," he said, "do not discuss any of this with your mother yet, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the next several days need to unfold in a particular order for your protection and hers. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I told him I could, and I spent the drive there in a strange, suspended state, not quite anxious and not quite calm, aware that I was about to learn something that would reframe everything I thought I understood about the last 2 years, but not yet knowing what shape that reframing would take. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected, tucked into the second floor of a building that housed 3 or 4 other small practices, nothing like the grand downtown firm that had handled the will reading 2 years earlier. He met me at the door himself, no receptionist buffering the introduction, and led me back to a conference room where a single folder sat waiting on an otherwise empty table, considerably thinner than the one left on my coffee table that morning, but somehow more substantial for its thinness. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "I want to tell you what your grandmother did, and why, before you look at any of this, because the documents will make more sense if you understand her thinking first. Dorth, your grandmother came to me almost 3 years before she passed," he said, "not to update her will, but to ask a question most clients never ask. She wanted to know what would happen to her estate if someone married into the family with the specific intention of extracting money from it. Not a hypothetical question, she was specific. She'd watched something like it happen to a friend of hers, another wealthy widow, whose son-in-law had spent the better part of a decade slowly redirecting the woman's assets before anyone in the family understood what was happening. Your grandmother didn't want that to happen to this family." I asked him what she'd done about it. "She restructured almost everything," he said. "Over the following 18 months, methodically, with full documentation at every step, she moved the substantial majority of her estate out of anything that would be governed by a standard will into an irrevocable trust, with you named as the sole beneficiary. The will that was read after her passing, the one your family heard, the one that named a considerably smaller figure, was accurate as far as it went. It simply didn't describe the whole estate. It described what she wanted visible. The trust described what she wanted protected." He slid the folder across the table, and I opened it to find exactly what he'd described. Transfer documents dated more than 2 years before before my grandmother's death, each one signed, witnessed, and notarized, filed with a precision that made the settlement folder from that morning look amateur by comparison. There were bank statements showing the movement of assets in stages, spread across 18 months so as not to trigger the kind of scrutiny a single large transfer might have. There was a letter, handwritten in the same small, precise script as the note I'd carried in my wallet for 2 years, addressed to him rather than to me. "Read the letter," he said. I read it there in the conference room, my grandmother's voice arriving on the page in a way that made the last several hours feel suddenly very far away. She wrote that she had no way of knowing whether her instincts about a future son-in-law were accurate, whether her fears would ever materialize into anything real, but that she had lived long enough to know that money finds its way toward the people willing to pursue it most patiently, and that patients deserve to be met with more patience still. She wrote that if anyone ever pressured me to redistribute assets after her death, whether through guilt, legal pressure, or the softer pressure of a family agreement dressed up as reasonableness, I was to preserve every communication, because she believed and had told her attorney directly that whoever came asking would eventually make a mistake that revealed exactly what they were after. She built the will as a decoy, I said, mostly to myself, understanding it fully for the first time as I said it out loud, on purpose, years in advance. She did, he said, and I want to be clear about something because I think it matters to you right now. This wasn't paranoia. Your grandmother wasn't a suspicious person by nature. She made this decision after watching what happened to her friend, after doing her own research into how these situations typically unfold, and after concluding that the only real protection was structural, not emotional. She couldn't stop your mother from marrying whoever she chose to marry. She couldn't have predicted specifically that it would be a man who had done this before, but she built a structure that would hold regardless of who eventually tried to test it. I sat with that for a long moment, looking at documents that had been sitting quietly in this office for years, waiting for a morning I hadn't known was coming until it arrived on my doorstep in a suit that didn't belong there. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "you forward me everything, every text message, every voicemail, every version of that settlement folder, and we let the timeline speak for itself." I forwarded the attorney everything that week, the settlement folder, every text message from my mother's husband that had arrived since, each one a little more direct than the last, some suggesting lawyers were an unnecessary expense, others offering to work something out privately, man to man, before things got complicated. I never replied to any of them. I just forwarded each one, exactly as instructed, and let the timeline build itself. Mediation lasted less than an hour. Once the trust documents were on the table, the mediator asked him a simple question. What evidence did he have that my grandmother had ever wanted the estate redistributed? He had opinions. He had a folder full of carefully worded suggestions. He had nothing else, and the silence that followed the question told the room everything it needed to know. My mother sat through most of it without speaking, looking between her husband and the documents like she was doing the same math my uncle had been doing at the wedding, arriving late at a conclusion the rest of us had reached hours earlier. As we walked out, he muttered that I'd chosen money over family. I didn't answer him, because I'd finally understood something my grandmother had known long before any of us did. The fastest way to lose a family is to hand its future to someone who believes he's entitled to it. The will everyone had fought over was never real. It was bait, built years in advance, and it caught the wrong person first.